In November 2025, a team of archaeologists was digging through Tomb 65 in an ancient Egyptian burial site about 100 miles south of Cairo. They had been working this particular cemetery for years. They knew what to expect. Bandaged bodies, pottery, amulets, the quiet, careful work of brushing sand off bones that had been still for centuries. And then one of them stopped, because this mummy was different. Resting flat across the abdomen of the wrapped body, placed there deliberately by someone 1,600 years ago during the embalming process, was a papyrus, a written document, folded and sealed and pressed against the dead man's stomach before the outer bandages went on. This was not a magic spell. It was not a religious formula. When the team carefully lifted it away and carried it to the laboratory, and the philologist leaned over it under the lights. In January 2026, and began to read the faded Greek letters, he recognized them immediately. It was Homer. It was the Iliad. One of the most famous stories in all of human history, written approximately 2,800 years ago, had spent the last 1,600 years packed inside a dead man's stomach in a sealed tomb in the Egyptian desert. Nobody in the entire history of archaeology had ever seen anything like it before. Not once, not ever. And nobody, right now, can fully explain why it was there. Stay with me until the very end of this video, because this story pulls together a dead man, a war poem, a city built on garbage, golden tongues placed inside mummies so they could speak to God, and a question that the world's best historians are still sitting with right now. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Why was the Iliad inside that body? I will read every single answer. Let us go back to the beginning. Not to 2025, but to the ancient city of Oxyrhynchus itself. Because to understand why this discovery is extraordinary, you first have to understand the city it came from. Oxyrhynchus sits in what is now Central Egypt, about 190 kilometers south of Cairo, in a region called the Minya Governorate. The modern town sitting on top of it is called Al-Bahnasa. Most people walking through it today have no idea what is sleeping underneath their feet, because Oxyrhynchus was once one of the most extraordinary cities in the ancient world. During the Greek and Roman periods of Egyptian history, it was the third largest city in Egypt. At its peak, it was a major administrative center, a hub of commerce, a place where Egyptian traditions and Greek culture and Roman power had been grinding against each other and blending together for centuries. The language of the educated class was Greek. The gods being worshipped were a strange mix of Egyptian and Greco-Roman. The burial practices were something no civilization had ever seen before or since. An eerie, beautiful collision of all three worlds happening at once. And it is also, wonderfully and absurdly, one of the most significant rubbish dumps in human history. When British archaeologists Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt arrived at Oxyrhynchus in 1897, they were hoping to find lost works of Greek literature buried somewhere in the ancient city. What they found instead was something no one had expected. The garbage heaps on the edge of the city were full of papyrus. Hundreds of thousands of fragments of written papyrus, thrown away by the city's ancient residents, preserved almost perfectly by the extreme dryness of the Egyptian desert. Shopping lists, legal contracts, personal letters, horoscopes, wills, and scattered among the everyday rubbish of daily life, fragments of plays, poems, gospels, and stories. Some of those fragments turned out to be works that the world had not seen for over 1,000 years. A play by Sophocles, poetry by Sappho, early Christian manuscripts. Grenfell famously wrote in his report that the flow of papyri from those mounds became a torrent that was difficult to cope with. Scholars have described Oxyrhynchus as the closest thing we have to discovering the Library of Alexandria in a landfill. That is not exaggeration. Today, approximately 70% of all ancient Egyptian literary papyri ever discovered come from Oxyrhynchus. The site has been producing discoveries for over 125 years and has not stopped yet. It was still producing discoveries in November 2025 when the team from the University of Barcelona, working under the direction of Maite Mascourt and Esther Pons through the Institute of Ancient Near East Studies, excavated Tomb 65 in Sector 22 of the ancient necropolis. The team, led on the ground by Nuria Castellano, uncovered a Roman-era burial complex containing multiple mummies. Some of them were wrapped in bandages decorated with geometric patterns. Some had traces of gold leaf applied to them after mummification. And inside several of the mummies, the excavators found golden tongues. Stop on that for a moment, because the golden tongues alone before you even get to the Iliad are remarkable. They are thin, leaf-shaped pieces of gold placed inside the mouths of the dead during the embalming process. The practice came from a belief that was completely unique to this era of Egyptian burial. The idea that the deceased would need to be able to speak when they arrived in the afterlife. That when they stood before Osiris, the god of the dead, for judgment, they would need a voice. Gold was the flesh of the gods in Egyptian belief. Placing a golden tongue in a dead person's mouth was a way of ensuring their voice would never fail them in the presence of the divine. Gold meant you were already speaking in the language of the gods. The team found 3 golden tongues and 1 copper tongue during the November and December 2025 excavation alone, bringing the total count of gold tongues discovered at Oxyrhynchus across multiple campaigns to 16. 16 people buried in that city who went to meet Osiris with a golden voice. But the mummy in Tomb 65 had something stranger than a golden tongue. When the conservators and archaeologists examined this particular body in detail, they found the papyrus laid directly on the abdomen, not tucked beside the body, not placed near the head, on the stomach as part of the specific layering of materials applied during the embalming process itself. It had been deliberately placed there, inside the wrappings, during the ritual preparation of the body. It had been sitting there, undisturbed, for approximately 1,600 years. Now here is what you need to understand about the papyri found in Egyptian mummies. It was not unheard of. The Oxyrhynchus mission had previously discovered Greek papyri in similar positions on other mummies at the same site. But every single time, without exception, those papyri contained the same kind of content: magic spells, religious rituals, protective formulas designed to guide the soul safely through the afterlife. The practical literature of the dead, designed to do a specific job in a specific supernatural context. That was the expected thing. That was the established pattern of 1,000 years of Egyptian funerary practice. What nobody expected, what had never happened in the entire history of Egyptian archaeology, was what Leah Mashia read when she examined the papyrus in the laboratory in January 2026. When she and classical philologist Ignacy Xavier Adiego of the University of Barcelona looked at the faded Greek text on that papyrus, they were looking at the catalogue of ships from Book 2 of Homer's Iliad. The catalogue of ships is one of the most famous passages in all of ancient literature. It is the section of the Iliad where Homer lists in exhaustive detail every contingent of the Greek army that sailed to Troy to fight for the return of Helen. Every ship, every commander, every city that sent men to that war. It runs for hundreds of lines. It is the kind of passage that every literate person in the ancient Greek and Roman world would have known, because Homer was the foundation of Greek education. Homer scholar Celsiana Warwick, an assistant professor of classics at the University of Iowa, explained exactly this when asked about the discovery. Homer, she said, was used as one of the primary texts that people were taught to read Greek with. It had canonical status and was read by basically every person literate in Greek. The Iliad was not exotic literature in 5th century Roman Egypt. It was as fundamental as the alphabet. And that is exactly what makes its presence inside this mummy so strange. If the embalmers wanted to put a protective magical text on this man's body, they had an entire tradition of established formulas to choose from. Spells from the Book of the Dead, ritual incantations that had been specifically designed over thousands of years for exactly this purpose. Instead, someone placed a page of Homer's war poem inside a dead man's stomach. And researchers are sitting with that question right now. Why? There are 2 main theories. The first is practical and somewhat deflating. Papyrus was expensive in the ancient world. Writing material was not cheap or easily available. Ancient scribes routinely reused papyrus, writing new texts over old ones, repurposing spent documents in whatever way was useful. The embalmers of Roman-era Egypt were known to pack body cavities with preserved materials. If a sheet of papyrus was what was available, it was used, regardless of what was written on it. Under this theory, one of the greatest poems in human history was stuffed inside a dead man's body the same way you might use an old newspaper to fill a box. The text was incidental. The material was what mattered. The second theory is far more interesting and far harder to prove. Writing in the ancient world was not always purely informational. Words could carry power, texts could be magical, not because of their specific content, but because of the act of writing itself, because of the concentration of meaning in the marks on the page. Homer was not just a story. Homer was the root of Greek civilization, the foundational myth of an entire culture. In a city like Oxyrhynchus, where Egyptian, Greek, and Roman traditions had been bleeding into each other for centuries, it is at least possible that Homer meant something more than literature to the person buried in Tomb 65. That whoever he was, whatever he believed, he went into death carrying the ships of Troy against his stomach, carrying the armies of the ancient world, carrying the words that had built the civilization he lived in. There is also a third possibility that the researchers themselves raised carefully. They do not know yet. More papyri from the same tomb are still undergoing restoration and analysis. Mascourt herself said publicly that they cannot rule out finding other literary texts in the same tomb. The investigation is ongoing. What looks like a wild exception right now might, with more analysis, begin to reveal a pattern in which educated, wealthy, Greek-speaking Egyptians in the Roman period were being buried not just with magical protection, but with the literature that had defined their lives. the words they loved, the stories that meant something to them. In which case, the man in Tomb 65 was not a puzzle. He was a person, a reader, someone for whom the words of Homer mattered enough that someone, perhaps family, perhaps priests, perhaps the embalmers following his own instructions, made sure those words went with him. The broader context of this discovery stretches far beyond one tomb. It is announced by Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities as one of the most significant recent finds in Middle Egypt. It was studied and verified by a team including conservators, papyrologists, and classical philologists from the University of Barcelona, one of the longest-running archaeological missions in Egypt, operating continuously at Oxyrhynchus since 1992. The findings were published and reported across the world's leading scientific platforms in April 2026. The Smithsonian, Scientific American, Live Science, Science Daily. This is not fringe archaeology. This is the establishment of the field, collectively recognizing that something genuinely unprecedented has happened at Oxyrhynchus. But zoom out even further and the picture gets richer still. The man in Tomb 65 was not buried in ancient Egypt. He was buried in Roman Egypt. By the time he died, probably sometime in the 5th century CE, the pharaohs had been gone for centuries. Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. After Alexander died, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took control and made it a Greek-speaking kingdom. Then Rome absorbed it. The old Egyptian religion still existed. Osiris was still worshipped. The golden tongues were still being placed in mouths so the dead could speak at divine judgment. But the language of the elite was Greek. The education system taught Homer. The culture was a layered, complicated, beautiful mess of 3 great civilizations pressed together under the Egyptian sun for hundreds of years. What was found in Tomb 65 is a physical artifact of that collision. The mummy is Egyptian. The embalming ritual is Egyptian. The golden tongue is Egyptian. And inside the body, pressed against the wrapped organs, is the most Greek text imaginable. Written in Greek, about Greek heroes, about the greatest military expedition in Greek mythology, the 3 worlds and a single dead man. Right now, as this video is airing, the research is continuing. The other papyri from Tomb 65 are still being restored and read. The identity of the man in the tomb is still unknown. He was an adult male, the team confirmed that much. But his name, his profession, his family, the life he lived in that city of layered civilizations, none of that is established yet. He is waiting for the same thing the nameless pharaoh of Abydos is waiting for. The same thing countless people buried in the sands of Egypt are still waiting for. To be known, to have a face and a story attached to the bones and the bandages and the 1,600-year-old sheet of poetry pressed against his abdomen. Here is what we know for certain. In November 2025, archaeologists opened a tomb. They found a man who had been carefully wrapped and embalmed and prepared for whatever came after death. They found gold nearby, the golden tongues of the other dead in the tomb, placed so the departed could speak before their god. And on this one man, this unknown adult male from the hybrid city of Oxyrhynchus, someone had placed Homer. The words of a poem about warriors sailing to war, about ships crossing a dark sea toward Troy, about the beginning of a story that has never stopped being told. Whether it was practical or spiritual, accidental or intentional, that papyrus crossed 1,600 years inside a sealed tomb and came out still readable. The words were still there, the ships were still sailing, and the man is still nameless, still waiting, still wrapped in a poem that the whole ancient world knew by heart. Tell me what you think in the comments right now. Was the Iliad placed inside this mummy on purpose, or was it just convenient scrap papyrus? And if you had to choose one book to take with you, what would it be? I genuinely want to know. Share this video too, because over 600 years is a long time to go unnoticed.